Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. Caleb Mercer sat in the left seat of his old 1978 de Havilland Beaver, both hands resting on the yoke with the practiced ease of a man who had learned long ago that the only thing he could trust was the machine beneath him. The floatplane hummed and shuddered gently as it tracked north along the Washington coastline, riding a ribbon of gray air between the cloud ceiling and the dark mirror of the water below. To his right, the forests of the Olympic Peninsula stretched endlessly inland, wall after wall of Douglas fir and Sitka spruce, ancient and indifferent, closing off the world as surely as any locked door. He was 48 years old. He looked older in the eyes. Titan lay behind him in the cargo area, strapped into his padded harness, chin resting on his forepaws, amber eyes half closed but never fully still. The Belgian Malinois had been with Caleb for 6 years, longer than any posting, longer than any relationship, longer than most things in Caleb's life that had ever stayed. Titan was 72 pounds of coiled intelligence, trained to detect, to track, to protect. But more than any of that, he was the single living creature on this earth who understood Caleb without needing him to speak a word. This was their route. 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Caleb filed a brief flight plan, more out of habit than obligation, and lifted off the narrow inlet behind his cabin, climbing into the sky the way other men reached for a drink, or a pill, or a Sunday sermon. The sky did not ask him questions. It did not look at him with that particular expression people wore when they learned what he had done, or where he had been, or what he had seen during 11 years in special operations that had taken him to places whose names he was still not permitted to say aloud. He had done 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, 3 classified deployments that existed only in sealed files and in the permanent architecture of his nightmares. He had been among the best, a man built by years of selection and suffering into something precise and terrible, a weapon shaped into human form. And then, on a hillside, in a country whose mountains turned purple at dusk, he had watched his closest friend, a man named Daniel O'Coffer from Columbus, Ohio, who had a daughter named Grace and a laugh like rolling thunder, take a breath that did not finish. Caleb had done everything right, everything he was trained to do, and it had not been enough. He resigned his commission 14 months later. He drove northwest until the highway ended. He found a cabin on the edge of the world, bought the old Beaver from a retired bush pilot, and told himself that this was not running, this was choosing. There was a difference. He had spent 3 years trying to believe that. The engine note changed slightly as Caleb adjusted his mixture, and Titan's ears lifted, those sharp triangular ears that caught frequencies no human could detect. Caleb glanced back at him briefly, a gesture so habitual it had become a form of conversation. Titan looked forward again and settled. All was well. For another 12 minutes, all was well. Then Titan rose. Not dramatically, not with barking or clawing. He simply stood up in his harness, every muscle in his body gone rigid in that way that Caleb had learned to read, the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm. The dog's nose worked rapidly, though they were 2,000 feet above the water and the cabin was sealed against the coastal wind. His eyes were fixed downward, locked on something below with an intensity that was almost human in its focus. Caleb frowned. "Easy," he said quietly. The word was less a command than a question. Titan did not ease. Caleb looked down through the side window. Below, maybe 1.5 miles off the main coastline, sat a small island he had flown over perhaps 200 times without a second thought. It was unremarkable, maybe 40 acres of rock and pine, no dock, no structure, no beach to speak of. It appeared on nautical charts as unnamed. In the years he had flown this route, he had never once seen a boat anchored near it, never seen smoke from a fire, never seen anything that suggested human presence. It was simply part of the landscape, like a period at the end of a sentence you had already forgotten reading. He looked down at it now, and he saw it. He almost didn't. The gray light was flat, the shadows long, and the shape was not immediately obvious from altitude. But something in the trained architecture of his mind, the part that had spent years learning to read terrain, to find things that did not want to be found, caught it and would not let go. He banked the beaver left, dropping 200 feet, circling back. There, on the narrow strip of rocky shore on the island's eastern edge, arranged with unmistakable deliberateness, were letters formed from driftwood and dark stone, large enough to be seen from the air. 3 letters that changed every calculation in his mind in the span of a single heartbeat. SOS. Caleb stared at it for 3 full seconds without breathing. His first thought was rational, a training exercise perhaps, or some kayaker's idea of a prank. His second thought was the thought of a man who had spent years in places where distress signals were not pranks. His body made its decision before his mind finished its argument. His hands moved on the yoke. He dropped lower, circling twice more, studying the shoreline, looking for a boat, looking for any sign of who had made that signal and when. There was no boat, no tent visible through the tree line, no movement on the shore, only the letters, patient and terrible in their stillness, speaking to him in the oldest language a person in danger could use. Titan was whining now, a low, continuous sound, barely audible over the engine, but Caleb heard it. He always heard it. "All right," Caleb said softly, to the dog, or to himself, or to Daniel O'Coffer, or to all the versions of himself he had tried to leave behind. "All right." He began his descent. The beaver's floats kissed the water cleanly, and Caleb taxied toward the island's eastern shore, cutting the engine as the hull drifted into the shallows. He unclipped Titan's harness, checked his sidearm, a habit so deep it required no thought, and stepped out onto the float, then down into ankle-deep waters so cold it drove the breath from his lungs. The island was silent, but it was not empty silence. It was the silence of aftermath. He found the campsite 30 meters into the tree line, and the sight of it stopped him mid-step. Someone had been here for days. A small tent, partially collapsed, its fabric torn at the seam by something or someone with force. Gear was scattered across the pine needles as though thrown in haste. A sleeping bag, a toppled camp stove, a canvas bag with its contents spilled, food containers, a water filter, a worn paperback novel with its spine broken. And there, half buried under a fallen pack, its blade dull with rust and something darker, a hunting knife. Caleb crouched and studied it without touching it. The darker stain was not old. Titan moved in slow, deliberate circles around the campsite, nose to the ground, reading a story written in scent that Caleb could only partially translate. The dog paused at the tree line on the camp's far side, stared into the forest, and looked back at Caleb with those amber eyes that held something very close to urgency. Caleb reached for his radio. Dead. He tried his satellite phone, the device that had never failed him in 7 years of remote flying. No signal. The island's geography, surrounded by ridgelines and dense canopy, had created a blackout zone as complete as any he had encountered in combat. He tried twice more, methodically, the way a trained man tries things, without panic, but without illusion either. He was alone, no backup, no communication. Someone was hurt, possibly in danger, possibly still in danger, somewhere in 40 acres of old-growth forest that swallowed sound and light in equal measure. He could take off, fly to the nearest town, contact the Coast Guard, return within the hour with people who carried badges and stretchers and the full weight of organized response. That was the logical choice. That was the safe choice. That was what a man who had carefully, deliberately rebuilt himself as a civilian would do. An hour. In his experience, an hour was geological time when someone was bleeding. Caleb stood. He looked at Titan. Titan looked back at him, steady, certain, asking nothing except whether they were going or staying. Something shifted in Caleb Mercer's chest. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a declaration. It was quieter than that, the way a locked door opens when someone finally finds the right key. He had carried that key for 3 years and told himself he had lost it. "Find," he said. One word, the word Titan had been trained on, the word that meant someone needs us, go. The dog turned and entered the forest, and Caleb followed, moving the way he had moved in 100 valleys and 100 rooftops and 100 places he had tried to forget. Low, quiet, controlled, every sense engaged. The soldier he had tried to bury rising through the earth of him like something that had never truly died. They moved through the forest for 11 minutes. Caleb tracked the broken ferns, the disturbed soil, the story of someone's passage written in the language of terrain. Titan moved ahead, but checked back regularly, that working dog intelligence, balancing speed with communication. They were not man and dog in those minutes. They were a unit. They found her at the base of a rock outcropping near the island's western shore. She was a woman, perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair matted against her cheek and a gash along her forearm that had been wrapped in a strip of clothing, improvised, competent. The work of someone who had not panicked entirely. She was conscious, barely. Her lips were pale with cold and blood loss, and her eyes, when they opened and found Caleb standing above her, widened with the particular terror of someone who had stopped believing that help would come. "I've got you," Caleb said, not loudly, not dramatically, the way a person says something true. "You're not alone anymore." Her name was Margaret. She had been kayaking solo, something she had done every September for 20 years in memory of her late husband, a Navy man who had loved this coastline. Her kayak had been driven onto the rocks by an unexpected squall 3 days ago. She had made it to the island, set up camp, and built that signal on the shore, using every ounce of determination a 60-year-old woman alone on a rock in the Pacific possessed. On the second night, she had fallen in the dark, gashed her arm on a broken branch, and had been conserving what little strength remained. She had not given up. Caleb cleaned her wound with the small kit he always carried, dressed it properly, gave her water and the emergency ration bar from his jacket pocket, and wrapped her in the emergency blanket he had retrieved from the plane. Titan lay pressed against her side, his warm body a furnace of quiet comfort, and Margaret rested her trembling hand on the dog's broad back with the instinct of someone who understood without being told that this animal was as much her rescuer as the man kneeling beside her. "How long have you been flying these waters?" she asked him, her voice still thin but steadying. Caleb considered the question for a moment. "Long enough," he said. He thought of Daniel. He thought of the purple mountains at dusk. He thought of the mornings he had sat in the cabin before dawn, unable to sleep, listening to the water, wondering what exactly he was saving himself for. He had told himself the flying was discipline, control, survival. He understood now that it had also been preparation, not for combat, for this, for her. for the simple and irreducible act of being in the right place when someone needed the specific thing that only he could give. Getting Margaret to the Beaver required 2 careful trips, one to bring supplies, one to carry her. Caleb moving through the forest with the same sure-footed precision that had once taken him through far darker terrain. Titan worked beside him without instruction, positioning himself to steady her, to guide, to simply be present, in the way that good dogs are present, wholly, without reservation, without asking to be thanked. The flight back to the mainland took 22 minutes. Caleb kept his voice calm and even the entire time, talking Margaret through every motion, every sound the old plane made, keeping her conscious and connected, while Titan lay beside her in the cargo area, his chin on her knee, breathing slowly as if teaching her how. The Coast Guard met them at the dock. Paramedics, a small crowd of people who had been notified by radio once Caleb had cleared the dead zone and gotten a signal through. Lights and motion and voices, the world rushing back in after 3 years of chosen quiet. Caleb stood on the dock after they took Margaret to the ambulance, and he watched the evening come down over the water, the sky going gold and then copper, and then the deep bruised blue of a Pacific Northwest dusk. Titan sat beside him, pressed against his leg, and Caleb put his hand on the dog's head without looking down. He stood there for a long time. He did not know what came next. He did not know if he would return to the cabin and the quiet and the careful distance he had built between himself and the world. He did not know if Margaret's daughter, who had arrived at the hospital in tears, would shake his hand and change something in him permanently. He did not know if he would sleep that night without the weight of Daniel's last breath on his chest. But he knew this. He had gone down when it mattered. He had not stayed in the sky. The soldier he had tried to bury had not disappeared. He had simply been waiting, patient as the forest, for the moment when his particular kind of courage was the only thing that stood between a life and its ending. And when that moment came, Caleb Mercer had not hesitated. Not because the fear was gone, but because something larger than the fear had finally, quietly taken its proper place. Titan looked up at him then, those amber eyes steady and warm and entirely without judgment, and Caleb felt something loosen in the architecture of his chest, something that had been locked since a hillside at dusk in a country far away. It did not leave him entirely. It may never leave him entirely, but it shifted the way a stone shifts in a riverbed after years of water, not gone, but no longer the same obstacle it once was. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not come dressed in ceremony or decorated with ribbons. It comes quietly on a gray Tuesday afternoon, in the hum of an old engine and the restlessness of a loyal dog, and the 3 letters left by a woman who refused to stop believing that someone would see her. It comes in the moment a broken man chooses, one more time, to descend. That is the courage that saves lives. That is the courage that saves the man who carries it. Caleb Mercer drove home along the coast road as the stars came out over the Pacific. Titan riding in the passenger seat with his nose pressed to the cracked window, tasting the cold night air. The radio was off. The silence was different now. Not the silence of a man hiding from his past, but the silence of a man who has looked at his past, acknowledged its weight, and chosen to carry it forward anyway. Tomorrow, he would file his flight plan for Thursday. He would climb into the Beaver. He would fly the coastline. And this time, he would look down not to escape what was below him, but to watch over it. Because some men are not built for stillness. Some men are built for the moment someone needs them most. And the best ones, the ones the world quietly depends on, never stop answering when called. If this story moved something in you, If you believe that loyalty, courage, and quiet heroism still matter in this world, then this channel was made for you. Here at Silent Paws and Brave Hearts, every story we tell is a tribute to the men, the women, and the extraordinary animals who remind us that we are never truly alone. If you haven't already, please subscribe so you never miss a story. Leave a comment below and tell us, is there a veteran, a dog, or a quiet hero in your life who deserves to have their story told? Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded today that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums at 2,000 feet. Sometimes it rests its chin on your knee. And sometimes it simply descends when the world needs it most. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay brave, stay loyal, and keep watching for the signals others leave behind.